Hello, hello, hello. Good to see you again. It's time for more Hobbit. Thank you again so much to my wonderful Patreon listeners and viewers. Without you, I wouldn't be able to keep doing this. Not just these recordings, but all of my recordings. It's because of you guys. Thank you so much. There was a silence, but that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If the goblins are so near that he smelt them, he thought, then they'll have heard his shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this will lead you to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, except when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again several times on nasty, jagged stones on the floor. A bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go at great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down, but at last the slope stopped, and the passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there at the bottom of a short incline he saw, filtering around the corner, a glimpse of light. Not red light, as of fire or lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. Then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner, and there came suddenly right into an open place, where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine through the doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins in full armor with drawn swords sitting just inside the door, watching with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him, whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master. It was not on his finger. With yells of delight the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting even to draw his sword, he stuck his hands in his pockets, and there was the ring still in his left pocket, and it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delighted. "Where is it?" they cried. "Go back up the passage," some shouted. This way," some yelled. "That way," others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armor clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do, and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what had happened, and to sneak behind a big barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, and so to get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by Feel. "I must get out the door, I must get out the door," he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. It was like a horrible game of blind man's buff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, and was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed and squeezed. He stuck. It was awful. His buttons got wedged on the edge of the door and the door post. He could see outside in the open air. There were a few steps running down into a narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins inside shouted, "There is a shadow by the door. Something is outside." Bilbo's heart jumped in his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, with bewildered goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hallooing and hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of shadows of trees, running quick and quiet, keeping out of the sun. So soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. Chapter 6. Out of the frying pan, into the fire. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on till sun began to sink westwards behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward, and he could see before him only ridges and slopes falling towards the lowlands and the plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have got right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where, oh where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I hope to goodness they're still not back in the power of the goblins." He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge and down the slopes beyond, but all the while very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now that he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back. Very miserable he felt about it, when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding downwards with a rocky wall in the left hand, and the other a ground sloped away where the dells below and the level path overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of those dells, under bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer. Suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders with a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He still got the ring on, for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. "I will give them all a surprise," he thought, as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels and wondering and debating what they were going to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on with the journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, or without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He's been more trouble than use so far," said one of them. "If we have to go back now in those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me look for him, or I go on and leave you here to get out of this mess as best as you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before this is all over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?" "You would have dropped him," said Dory, "if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped your feet, and kicked you in the back." "Well, then why didn't you pick him up again?" "Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting, and everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Orquist. All of a sudden, you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw goblins running back and yelping, and you shouted, 'Follow me, everybody!' And everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards out of the lower door and helter-skelter down there, and here we are, without a burglar confusticate him." "And here's the burglar," said Bilbo, stepping down in the middle of them, slipping off his ring. Bless me, how they jumped! They shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, and probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told them what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right by them without a warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise, he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, you know, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it's the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted," said Balin. "I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service," he said. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. They all wanted to know about his adventures after them, and after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything except about finding the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and shuddered most appreciatively at the description of Gollum. "And then I couldn't think of any other question with sitting beside me," said Bilbo. "So I said, 'What's in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But he came at me to kill me, and so I ran, and I fell over, and he missed me in the dark, and then I followed him, because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, so he was making for it. And then he sat down at the entrance, and I could not get by, so I jumped over him and escaped, and ran down to the gate." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh, yes, lots, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was open only a crack, and I lost lots of my buttons," he said, sadly looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed right through, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect. When he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has a lot more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of the tale he had left out. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll continue our tale next time.